Picture this. It is February 1408, and you are hacking a path through the frozen mud of the Scottish borderlands, marching straight toward a slaughter known as the Battle of Bramham Moor. The man leading this desperate column is no common outlaw. He is Henry Percy, the first Earl of Northumberland, the architect of the English throne. Just 9 years ago he crowned King Henry IV. Today, he is trading stolen church silver for frozen horse meat just to keep his men from starving. His army is a staggering contrast to his former glory. Instead of highly trained knights, he commands a starving mob of Scottish raiders and fugitive Welsh rebels. His fingers are turning black with frostbite. The Royal Treasury's secret ledgers from this exact month reveal a brutal truth. The greatest lord in England was completely bankrupt, forced to launch a suicidal invasion simply because he could no longer afford to hide. How did the ultimate kingmaker end up leading a frozen death march? Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. Forget noble quests for justice or divine right. The Percy Rebellion ignited over a simple, brutal reality: unpaid bills. Henry Percy literally bankrolled the usurpation of the English throne. He funded Henry IV's armies out of his own deep pockets. He spent a fortune securing the violent northern borders, paying garrison wages and feeding thousands of soldiers while waiting for royal reimbursement. The crown promised repayment. Those gold shipments never arrived. Financial rolls from the royal exchequer paint a picture of calculated economic strangulation. The king deliberately withheld funds from the Percys, redirecting taxes to his own loyalists. Henry IV knew a wealthy, independent northern warlord was the only man who could unseat him. He squeezed his old friend economically until Percy had absolutely no choice but to draw steel. That initial uprising ended in a bloody disaster at Shrewsbury in 1403, costing Percy his famous son, Hotspur. 2 years later, a second failed revolt forced the old earl to abandon his ancestral castles entirely. The crown immediately seized his estates, cutting off the massive revenue streams that fueled his military machine. Stripped of his wealth, Percy spent 3 grueling years as a fugitive. He moved constantly between Scotland, Wales and France, trying to bribe foreign enemies into supporting his claim. Running a shadow government in exile drained the last of his personal fortune. Time simply ran out. By the time he crossed back into Yorkshire, he was out of money, out of allies, and out of options. He wasn't marching south to conquer. He was launching a desperate gamble to reclaim his home before his borrowed army collapsed from starvation. Armies in the 15th century did not fight in February. The entire military apparatus of medieval Europe was built around the harvest season. You marched in spring, fought in summer, and went home in autumn. Winter campaigning was considered logistical suicide. The earth froze solid, making it impossible to dig defensive trenches or bury the dead. More importantly, winter destroyed the very foundation of medieval warfare: foraging. A moving army of 3,000 men requires at least 6,000 pounds of food every single day just to survive, not counting the massive caloric needs of their war horses. You couldn't carry that much grain on wagons over frozen, deeply rutted mud roads. You had to steal it from the local peasantry. But in February 1408, the granaries of Yorkshire were locked tight and the fields were buried under snow. So why did Henry Percy, a veteran commander with decades of military experience, choose to launch an invasion during the most hostile month of the year? He did it because he had to. Exchequer records show his French and Scottish creditors were cutting him off. The Scottish lords who had sheltered him were growing tired of funding a stateless English earl. They gave him a ragged force of border reivers and told him to reclaim his lands or die trying. Percy knew that if he waited for the spring thaw, King Henry IV would have time to raise a massive, well-supplied royal army from the south. The Earl's only advantage was speed and the element of surprise. He gambled that by attacking in the dead of winter, he could catch the northern authorities off guard, rally his old loyalists in Yorkshire, and seize enough castles to establish a fortified stronghold before the king could react. It was a desperate calculation of economics over tactics. As Percy's mixed force of Scottish mercenaries and Welsh exiles crossed the River Tweed and pushed south into English territory, the reality of winter logistics immediately began to dismantle them. Chronicles from the period describe the agonising pace of the march. Leather boots froze and cracked. The humidity in the northern air clung to mail armour, dropping the temperature of the steel directly against the men's bodies. To prevent frostbite, soldiers stuffed their clothing with dry straw, but when it snowed, that straw became a wet, freezing sponge. By the time they reached the estates of Yorkshire, hoping to find eager supporters ready to join the rebellion, they found only closed doors and terrified peasants. The local gentry, many of whom had fought for the Percys for generations, looked at this starving, frostbitten mob of foreigners and made a cold, calculated political decision. They barred their gates. Percy's great winter gamble was failing. He had the surprise he wanted, but he was completely running out of food, and the man tasked with stopping him was already closing the trap. Sir Thomas Rokeby did not wait for royal permission to act. As the Sheriff of Yorkshire, he represented the brutal, efficient reality of local medieval governance. King Henry IV remained hundreds of miles away in London, suffering from a horrific, unidentified skin disease that was slowly eating away at his flesh and keeping him bedridden. A royal army rescue was mathematically impossible. Rokeby knew that if Percy captured a major stronghold like York, the rebellion would dig in, survive the winter, and fracture the kingdom entirely. The sheriff had to crush the invasion immediately using only local manpower. He invoked the posse comitatus. This ancient legal mechanism functioned as a mandatory draft, requiring every able-bodied free man in the Shire between the ages of 15 and 60 to mobilise. English law dictated that blacksmiths, butchers and peasant farmers must own specific weapons based strictly on their annual income. Rokeby rode aggressively across the frozen Yorkshire countryside, hammering on doors and demanding the local gentry fulfil their feudal obligations. The response mobilised terrifyingly fast. Men who had spent their entire lives living under the shadow of the Percy family now actively turned against their former lords. They acted out of self-preservation rather than deep loyalty to the sick king in London. Percy's invading army consisted heavily of Scottish border raiders. According to the chronicles of Thomas Walsingham, the sight of these historic, blood-sworn enemies marching through Yorkshire soil triggered an immediate, violent backlash. Local knights and yeomen grabbed longbows, poleaxes and rusted armour from their barns, swarming to Rokeby's banner. By the middle of February, the sheriff assembled a force perfectly designed to counter Percy's desperate mob. Rokeby's militia lacked elite military training. Their true strength lay in three massive logistical advantages. They were well fed, they operated close to their own warm hearths, and they fought desperately to protect their winter food stores from being looted. Percy, meanwhile, bled manpower by the hour. The Earl attempted to force a breakthrough at Grimbold Bridge near Knaresborough, hoping to smash the local resistance and open a path south. Rokeby flatly refused to give him a clean fight. The sheriff utilised his intimate knowledge of the local terrain to shadow the rebel army, blocking roads and slaughtering their isolated foraging parties. He deliberately starved them out. Trapped in a frozen wasteland and boxed in by local militia who knew every river crossing, Percy realised he could not outrun the sheriff. Exhausted and completely outmanoeuvred, the old Earl ordered his starving men to turn and make a final stand on a miserable stretch of snow-covered ground known as Bramham Moor. By the afternoon of February 19th, 1408, the illusion of a glorious rebellion collapsed into a freezing, miserable reality at a place called Bramham Moor. This was not a carefully chosen tactical position for the Earl of Northumberland. It was a dead end. Percy's exhausted army of Scottish mercenaries and northern rebels had been relentlessly herded onto this open expanse by Sheriff Rokeby's local militia. Then the weather itself turned into a devastating weapon. The deep winter freeze suddenly broke. A rapid, unseasonal thaw turned the snow-covered moor into a sprawling nightmare of freezing mud. That sudden shift in temperature completely altered the brutal geometry of the upcoming slaughter. Hollywood films love to depict medieval warfare as a canvas of thundering heavy cavalry charges. The geography at Bramham Moor cancelled that entirely. A standard destrier warhorse carrying a fully armoured knight weighs over 1,500 pounds. Plunge those hooves into knee-deep freezing slurry, and a devastating charge instantly degrades into an agonising crawl. Percy's commanders looked at the ground and immediately realised they were locked into a brutal infantry slog. Men had to dismount and trudge through the freezing muck wearing 60 pounds of steel armour that was rapidly siphoning the last remaining body heat from their bones. The psychological toll on the rebel army was absolute. They were starving, suffering from advanced frostbite, and looking up at a vastly superior defensive line. Rokeby's Yorkshire militia held the higher, drier ground. More importantly, they deployed a terrifying number of fresh longbowmen. The logistics of winter archery dictate the survival of an army. The Yorkshire levies were well rested, and they carried dry hemp bowstrings carefully preserved under their clothing. A wet or frozen string loses its tension, rendering a lethal warbow completely useless. The sheriff had protected his arsenal. Percy's archers, having spent 3 weeks marching through blizzards and sleet, held weapons that were practically compromised. When the two forces finally locked eyes across the desolate moor, the disparity shattered whatever morale the rebels had left. Drawing a 150-pound warbow requires immense upper body strength and feeling in your fingertips. The Scottish and Welsh mercenaries in Percy's ranks could barely grip their weapons, let alone return fire effectively. Percy knew a prolonged standoff meant total desertion. His hired men were dangerously close to dropping their weapons and fleeing into the hills. He had to force a decisive, bloody engagement before his army completely dissolved from exposure and fear. Drawing his sword with blackened, frostbitten fingers, the once mighty Kingmaker ordered a desperate uphill advance into the waiting line of the Yorkshire militia. The sky above the moor darkened as Rokeby's archers unleashed their first, devastating volley, sending thousands of steel-tipped bodkin arrows screaming down into the mud. The first volley of arrows did not sound like a cinematic whistle. Accounts from survivors of similar 15th century engagements describe the noise of a massed longbow volley as a deafening sound, like a massive sheet of canvas being violently ripped in half. Thousands of bodkin arrows rained down on the rebel vanguard. These specific projectiles were forged with narrow, chisel-like heads, engineered purely to punch through chainmail and exploit the gaps in plate armour. The physical reality of an arrow strike in sub-zero conditions is horrific. The rebel armour, already heavily compromised by rust, moisture and the extreme cold, became dangerously brittle. When a quarter-pound projectile travelling at over 150 feet per second slammed into a freezing breastplate, the kinetic energy often shattered the cold metal rather than cleanly piercing it. The arrows drove jagged shards of frozen steel, along with dirty, wet clothing deep into the flesh. Infection was an absolute certainty, but most of these men would not live long enough to worry about gangrene. The psychological effect of this barrage was immediate and devastating. Percy's army relied heavily on Scottish border reivers and Welsh outlaws. These men were essentially mercenaries, motivated entirely by the promise of plunder and a quick payday. The fundamental rule of mercenary economics is incredibly simple. You cannot spend your loot if you are dead. Facing a relentless, blinding storm of arrows and trapped in knee-deep freezing mud, the financial calculation for the mercenaries abruptly changed. They realised the bankrupt Earl of Northumberland could not protect them. They were certainly not going to die in a frozen Yorkshire swamp for an English lord's personal family feud. Panic spreads through an army faster than dysentery. Entire blocks of Percy's infantry broke formation. Scottish fighters dropped their heavy shields and weapons directly into the muck, turning their backs to the arrow storm in a desperate attempt to sprint away. This was the exact moment the battle stopped being a tactical engagement and transformed into a mechanical slaughter. Sheriff Rokeby's archers simply adjusted their elevation and shot the fleeing mercenaries in their unprotected backs. As the flanks of his army dissolved into screaming, chaotic flight, Henry Percy found himself dangerously isolated in the centre of the field. His hired muscle was evaporating. Only his core retinue of hardcore northern loyalists, men whose families had served the Percys for over a century, remained standing. Realising the battle was completely lost, they locked their shields, lowered their heads, and forced their way through the mud toward the Yorkshire militia lines. They were no longer trying to win the crown. They were fighting simply to close the distance, crash into the sheriff's men, and inflict as much damage as possible before the inevitable end. When they finally hit Rokeby's defensive line, the combat degenerated instantly into a claustrophobic, suffocating brawl. The reality of a 15th century armoured melee is nothing like the elegant swordplay of modern fantasy. When the Earl of Northumberland's surviving loyalists slammed into the Yorkshire militia, the combat instantly compressed into a suffocating crush of bodies. Men pressed chest to chest, screaming in each other's faces, their boots sinking deeper into the freezing mud with every violent shift in weight. Plate armour renders slashing swords almost completely useless in this kind of tight formation. To kill a man wrapped in steel, you need concentrated blunt force trauma. Rokeby's militiamen swung massive poleaxes, heavy halberds, and iron-flanged maces. These were agricultural tools modified for slaughter, weapons designed specifically to cave in helmets, shatter collarbones, and puncture hardened steel breastplates. Every swing required immense oxygen. Every step through the knee-deep slurry drained whatever reserves of stamina the rebels had left. The ambient temperature remained freezing, but inside their steel shells the men were boiling with sweat, gasping frantically for air through the narrow restrictive ventilation slits of their visors. Oxygen deprivation became as deadly as the enemy. If you slipped and fell in this chaotic moving press, getting back up was a mathematical impossibility. The sheer weight of the armoured bodies fighting violently above you would push you face first into the freezing muck. We know from forensic evidence of similar battles that dozens of veteran soldiers did not die from blunt force or piercing wounds at Bramham Moor. They drowned in 2 inches of bloody mud, trampled into the earth by the frantic boots of their own comrades. In the absolute centre of this horrific meat grinder stood Henry Percy and his closest political ally Thomas Lord Bardolph. The Loyalist Corps fought desperately to protect them, but the numbers heavily favoured the local levies. Lord Bardolph took a catastrophic, blinding blow to the head. A poleaxe crushed through his helmet, inflicting a massive wound that immediately knocked him out of the fight. He would linger in absolute agony for days before dying of his injuries, but his sudden collapse on the field effectively broke the remaining rebel momentum. Then, the Kingmaker fell. The historical records do not grant Henry Percy a poetic, honourable death. He did not cross swords with Sheriff Rokeby in a dramatic, personalised final duel. Instead, the man who had overthrown kings, the absolute wealthiest warlord of the northern borders, was simply swallowed by the brutal, anonymous violence of the militia line. Exhausted, freezing, and vastly outnumbered, Percy was beaten down into the mud by local men whose names history never bothered to record. A fatal strike, most likely from a common yeoman's halberd or heavy warhammer, ended the life of the first Earl of Northumberland. The architect of the English throne died choking on freezing mud, surrounded by the shattered remnants of a borrowed army. When the remaining northern rebels saw the old wolf finally go down, the line entirely collapsed. The battle was officially over, but the ruthless butchery of the routed survivors was just beginning. Sheriff Thomas Rokeby had crushed the rebellion, but the political mechanics of a medieval victory required more than simply leaving the dead to rot in the mud. Henry Percy was not just a traitor. He was a historic symbol of northern independence and military might. King Henry IV needed that symbol thoroughly and publicly dismantled. The old Earl's corpse was dragged out of the freezing slurry of Bramham Moor. By royal decree, high treason demanded a specific, grisly anatomical theatre. Percy's head was brutally severed from his shoulders, and the rest of his body was butchered into 4 distinct quarters. Moving decaying human flesh across 15th century England took time, especially in winter. To ensure the Earl's remains survived the journey to different corners of the kingdom without rotting away completely, local butchers were hired to process the body. They boiled the severed quarters and packed them heavily with coarse salt and expensive preserving spices. This was a considerable logistical expense, meticulously recorded in local financial rolls. The Crown willingly paid a premium for this macabre preservation because the psychological terror it generated was invaluable. The salted quarters were dispatched to Newcastle, Berwick, Lincoln and York. These were the exact cities where the Percy name traditionally commanded the absolute most respect and loyalty. His head was sent directly south to London. It was impaled on a rusted iron spike above London Bridge, placed as a grotesque warning to anyone entering the capital. While the King's agents butchered the Earl, Sheriff Rokeby had to deal with the surviving Scottish and Welsh mercenaries. Medieval laws of ransom applied strictly to the wealthy elite. A captured knight was a lucrative financial asset, worth his weight in silver, and would be kept alive comfortably. A captured foreign mercenary, however, was a massive logistical liability. They consumed winter food rations the sheriff simply did not have. Consequently, Rokeby ordered a ruthless, immediate purge. Hundreds of fleeing rebels who attempted to surrender were hunted down in the snow and summarily executed on the spot. Those lucky enough to survive the initial slaughter faced a slower death. They were systematically stripped of their armour, their weapons, their heavy wool cloaks and their boots, then driven naked back into the freezing northern wilderness to die of exposure. The local Yorkshire economy rapidly absorbed the spoils of the massacre. Village blacksmiths melted down captured Scottish swords, and common yeomen claimed the dented armour of the dead. The Great Northern Rebellion was not merely defeated, it was cannibalised for local profit. The salted head of Henry Percy arrived in London a few weeks after the slaughter at Bramham Moor. It was immediately hoisted onto a spike above London Bridge, joining a macabre collection of the King's former friends and allies. King Henry IV had finally achieved total military victory. The Great Northern Rebellion was entirely extinguished. The warlord who had crowned him was dead, his private armies scattered, and his massive estates absorbed by the crown. Yet, there were no grand victory parades in the capital. The king could barely stand up to look at his prize. While Sheriff Rokeby was freezing in the mud of Yorkshire, King Henry IV was trapped inside the royal apartments at Westminster, physically decaying. Contemporary chroniclers, particularly Thomas Walsingham, recorded horrifying details about the monarch's failing health. Sometime around 1405, shortly after he ordered the execution of the Archbishop of York for supporting the Percys, the king contracted a severe, disfiguring illness. Modern medical historians debate whether it was severe cardiovascular disease, congenital syphilis, or a virulent form of leprosy. The exact pathogen hardly matters. The physical reality was agonising. The king suffered from extreme fatigue, severe abdominal pain, and horrific pustules that erupted across his face and hands. In the highly superstitious environment of the 15th century English court, biology was always interpreted through the lens of theology. You could not separate a man's physical health from his spiritual standing. Henry had usurped the throne from his cousin, Richard II. He had ordered the execution of an anointed archbishop. He had systematically hunted down and butchered the very men who had financed his rise to power. When his skin began to rot and his legs refused to carry him, the medieval public reached a swift, terrifying consensus. This was a direct divine strike. God was actively punishing the usurper. The psychological isolation of the king in his final years was absolute. He had spent his entire reign fighting desperately to keep the crown, heavily taxing the kingdom to fund endless civil wars against the Welsh, the Scots, and the Percys. Now, having successfully killed all his major domestic rivals, he was a prisoner in his own decaying body. He could no longer ride a horse. He could no longer lead troops into battle. The victory at Bramham Moor secured the Lancaster dynasty, but it bankrupted the monarch biologically and financially. The royal treasury remained severely depleted from the sheer cost of putting down these continuous rebellions. Henry Percy died screaming in a frozen swamp, but his executioner slowly wasted away in a silk-lined bed, heavily medicated and terrified of his own divine judgment. The king had won the war of logistics and local militias, but the immense bloodshed required to secure his stolen throne left a permanent, festering wound on the psychology of the English monarchy. The execution of Henry Percy did not bring peace to northern England. It created a massive, unstable political vacuum. For over a century, the Crown had actively outsourced the defence of the Scottish border to the Percy family. They functioned as a necessary regional monopoly, absorbing the immense financial burden of maintaining stone castles and paying private standing armies. King Henry IV completely smashed that monopoly at Bramham Moor, but he immediately realised he could not afford to replace it with royal troops. The central treasury simply lacked the gold required to garrison the northern frontier year-round. To physically secure the border against Scottish raids, the ailing king had to elevate a rival northern bloodline. He aggressively redistributed the confiscated Percy estates to the Neville family. This was a catastrophic long-term miscalculation. By transferring absolute regional dominance from one local warlord to another, the Lancaster dynasty effectively built the very military machine that would destroy them 50 years later. The Nevilles would eventually use those exact same resources to back the House of York during the Wars of the Roses, plunging the entire country into an even bloodier and more devastating civil conflict. Political eradication is rarely absolute in a feudal system. The king had killed the old earl and his famous son Hotspur, but the Percy bloodline survived in the shadows. A single young boy, Hotspur's son, remained completely isolated in Scotland. He was essentially a high-value political hostage, raised among the very enemies his grandfather had spent a lifetime fighting. His survival terrified the English court because medieval legitimacy was entirely tied to genetics. As long as a male heir drew breath, the Percy claim to the northern lands remained legally valid in the eyes of the local populace. This dynamic initiated a grueling, decades-long diplomatic Cold War. The Scottish Crown fully recognised the immense value of their young captive. They used him as a geopolitical bargaining chip, demanding massive ransoms and border concessions in exchange for keeping the boy away from English territory. It was a perfect demonstration of medieval political economics. An exiled, landless child held more leverage than an army of armoured knights, simply because his family name alone could still instantly mobilise thousands of angry, heavily armed Yorkshiremen. Henry IV went to his grave without ever solving this problem. He won the immediate tactical victory, butchered the rebel leadership, and terrorised the northern counties into temporary submission. The underlying economic and social fractures, however, remained entirely unresolved. The fundamental tension between a centralised, underfunded king and wealthy, heavily armed regional lords was permanently baked into the DNA of the kingdom. Bramham Moor was not the conclusion of the Percy Rebellion. It was merely a brutal, freezing rehearsal for the dynastic slaughter that was about to consume the entire English nation. The Battle of Bramham Moor remains a historical footnote, heavily overshadowed by the famous clash at Shrewsbury and the apocalyptic carnage of the later Wars of the Roses. Yet, this freezing slaughter in Yorkshire reveals the most unromantic, brutal truth about medieval warfare. Battles were rarely decided by divine right, chivalrous duels, or noble causes. They were decided by wheat, dry bowstrings, and unpaid invoices. Henry Percy, the first Earl of Northumberland, was arguably the most powerful subject in English history. He possessed enough personal wealth and private military force to physically remove one king and crown another. But his ultimate destruction did not come from a grand strategic masterstroke by his enemies. It came from a calculated economic strangulation. King Henry IV simply stopped paying his bills, forcing his greatest ally into a desperate bankrupt rebellion. When Percy made his final gamble in the dead of winter, he violated the absolute fundamental laws of military logistics. You cannot feed an army on frozen mud. You cannot fire a heavy warbow with frostbitten fingers. Sheriff Thomas Rokeby did not need to be a military genius to defeat the ultimate kingmaker. He merely had to leverage his local resources, mobilise a well-fed regional militia, and let the brutal Yorkshire winter do the heavy lifting. The rebel army collapsed from the inside long before the first arrow was ever fired. They were defeated by exposure, starvation, and the terrifying realisation that mercenary loyalty evaporates the exact moment the gold runs out. The severed, salted quarters of Henry Percy sent across the kingdom served as a gruesome warning, but they also masked a profound royal insecurity. The Lancaster crown survived Bramham Moor, but the structural damage to the kingdom was permanent. By utterly crushing the Percys and redistributing their wealth to rival northern families, the sick king accidentally armed the very factions that would eventually tear England apart. The bloody, inescapable cycle of king-making and betrayal was now permanently embedded in the political system. Popular history often romanticises the medieval era as a time of noble knights fighting for honour and glory. Bramham Moor strips away that romantic veneer entirely. It shows of starving men drowning in mud, bankrupt lords begging for foreign scraps, and sick kings rotting in their beds while they butcher their former friends. It is a stark, terrifying reminder that the gears of history are rarely turned by nobility or justice. They are turned by logistics, financial leverage, and the cold, unforgiving reality of human survival. If you found this deep dive into the brutal realities of medieval history fascinating, please hit that like button and make sure to subscribe to the channel. We have plenty more forgotten battles and hidden historical truths to uncover together. Leave a comment below letting me know what historical event you think is severely misunderstood by modern pop culture, and we might just cover it in a future video. Until next time, keep questioning the past